Jean, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, but I was muted.
I would like to...
Your voice is too shrill.
That we made, or the blood that's spilled for someone else's profit but would never be repaid. There's a useless hope of the afterlife, but it can't assuage all the toil and strife, and the pious who will promise so much more don't know what they're standing for anymore. Show some understanding for those who can't hope for more. Know just what they're standing for. Find some understanding for those who kneel to and for. Know just what they're standing for. There's a sound in the attic of memories erratic, a firm resolution for an eternal constitution. The bravery of self-defense against the pall of ignorance. A shudder to adore those who don't know what they're standing for. Find some understanding for those who can't hope for more. Know just what they're standing for. Be someone standing for. Take a knee on the floor. Know just what you're standing for.
Kelly, you need to unmute your mic.
I'm sorry. Now, okay, good evening to everybody. I'd like to thank everyone who's here to this roundtable, this phenomenal roundtable we are having tonight. It's an honor for me, representing the National Institute of Science and Technology and Digital Democracy, to chair such a qualified roundtable. Welcome, Lance Bennett.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It was quite a challenge. Unfortunately, I'm on my phone, which I don't know how well it's going to hold up. In fact, it's almost out of battery.
Okay. I would like to warn everybody that I'll be just a facilitator here, because I know there are many researchers who are watching us now and are very anxious to make interesting and stimulate questions for you. Now I would like to present our guests. So I will read. Jean Burgess is a professor at Queensland University of Technology, School of Communication, and director of the Digital Media Research Center. Professor Burgess' work focuses mainly on the argument that the politicization of digital platforms has made them less useful as civic infrastructure, which comes partly from a feminist cultural studies perspective. I'd like to stress one of her research projects, which is using machine vision to explore Instagram's everyday promotional cultures. Lance Bennett is a professor of political science and communication at University of Washington. He's director of the Center for Communication and Civic Engagement, which focuses on how communication can enhance citizen engagement with society, politics, and global affairs. In addition to civic engagement, his other fields of interests are comparative politics, environmental politics, media studies, political communication, and sustainability, and others. Dear professors, your work has been very important for us to think about participation at a time when the idea of collective and public, the foundation of politics, seems to be losing space to individualist ideas or ideals. I hope to live up to this very important and necessary debate. The National Institute of Science and Technology in Digital Democracy welcomes you both, and I ask you, please feel at home. So we are going to start with Professor Jean Burgess.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, Lance. Glad you could make it to join us. I'm going to switch over to. Sorry, I'm going to switch over to my slides now. So I'm going to talk briefly today about some of those themes that Kelly mentioned in the introduction, but very much through the lens of a project that I have published with Nancy Baim from Microsoft Research earlier this year, which is called Twitter, a Biography. But this question of how platforms and their publics, or in industry terms, users, co-evolve, that's been a running theme in all of my work, including the work that I did on YouTube 10 years ago with Joshua Green. So I don't think I probably need to tell you as an audience that social media, far from being considered mere trivialities or time wasters, have come to occupy center stage in contemporary political and public life. They're both considered to be primary and perhaps dangerous actors in formal electoral politics, and they're also the site of politics, of political contestation about what counts as public communication, what counts as public value, and how, I suppose, digital citizenship can and should be enacted on the behalf of us, ordinary citizens. So just a few headlines there, which I think highlight this. And of course, in the US right now, these major platforms are getting a lot of heat, and the subject of challenges around antitrust issues and so on. I want to say a bit about this concept of platforms, which of course is both a metaphor that has multiple meanings, but I think also a really useful one because of those multiple meanings. So if we think about the perhaps a much earlier use of the term platform, in this case, a stage upon which people can have a voice, but only under certain arrangements and with an awful lot of infrastructural work that goes on literally behind the scenes. Platforms are places where publics can be convened and can see each other and know themselves as publics, but they are political. So they both mediate politics and they have a politics. And what I mean by platforms is both the back-end architecture or software, the front-end interface that we see, and the kind of cultures that they mediate, that they enable. But when you get down to it as a researcher, as an analyst, really trying to describe what platforms are, unless you just want to adopt the industry definition, which is that Twitter is what Twitter Incorporated thinks it is, and as a company, as a set of architectures, which is to leave out entirely the user base and its activities in the public, then they're quite analytically slippery. So the task that Nancy and I kind of set ourselves in our study of a short history of Twitter was to how to actually use this process of writing the history of Twitter to try to theorize better how to understand platforms as dynamic objects that change over time. Probably a quite significant shift, I would say, from early internet studies or social media studies, which is very much about snapshots, very much about the latest thing, perhaps. So the result of this work is this book, Twitter, a Biography, published with New York University Press earlier this year, 2020. And you can grab it from a bookstore near you. It's also available on Audible. And the entire introduction where we lay out this theoretical model is available for free as a PDF from the NYU Press website. So really, if we think back to the beginning of Twitter, which was in the mid-2000s, in the social media era, where, of course, social media companies' names did not have vowels in them. If you think of Flickr and Twitter and Tumblr. And this was a service that was developed really for people to share, to broadcast ephemeral everyday life updates to their friends via SMS, hence the 140 character limit. It was very much about mundane sociability rather than even thinking of connecting to the mainstream news environment or large-scale political processes. Users simply responded to the question, what are you doing, with a short text update. So one of the very early employees, co-founders, used it in this way to just comment on the mundanity and banality of the platform itself. Sorry, Jack Dorsey, who's the current CEO and also a co-founder, answers the question very literally in a one-word tweet. About a year later, in early 2007, both Nancy and I, as internet scholars, decided that we should probably figure out what this Twitter thing was. And again, we're answering the question, what are you doing, quite literally. And you can see that in my first tweets, very, very mundane. These days, we're no longer asked, what are we doing? We're asked, what's happening? So from a me-centered or interpersonal-centered platform to a world-centered one. As we all know, Twitter is a very large platform with a presence in a large number of countries, in a large number of languages. It's been at the center of major political protests. It's become entangled in challenges around misinformation, around mainstream politics, but also dealing with things like massive global pandemics. So the question kind of was, how did we get from there to here? And here, meaning that Twitter is also a major actor in massive popular culture movements. So, beware the K-pop fans, basically, as we saw with some events around the Trump campaign last year. How do we get from what are you doing? The answer being something incredibly mundane and just for your friends, to Twitter being a major actor in the news and political environment, but also being considered to be a big problem for the news and political environment. So here's a bit about the theoretical framework that we're adopting here, where we consider platforms to be an assemblage of these different dynamics and processes. We have the front stage that you will see when you use Twitter, the user interface and features. We have the backstage software, algorithms, APIs that connect different software, different data brokering companies, different advertising companies together, a whole ecosystem of devices and services that connect around that. But we also have competing, variable, and diverse cultures of use, from the different kinds of communicative and expressive content that are thought to be appropriate to the platform, different practices and understandings of users, different norms about what it means to use Twitter well or not well, and arguments about those things. And of course, the public discourse about the platform, which the company plays a major role in itself. And tying all of that together, being influenced by all of that and influencing it, the changing business models of social media platforms. In order to go about doing this research, of course, we needed to mine the archives. So at the time when we started this project, Twitter had just made available the possibility to retrieve your own archive, your complete archive of tweets. And we thought this would be a really nifty way to prompt reflections from users who'd been on the platform for a while about how it had changed, how their experience had changed. So we conducted a series of oral history interviews using a kind of scroll back methodology, where we used people's individual archives as prompts. We also relied heavily on the Internet Archive Wayback Machine, just a lot of deep dives through the history of media and tech press coverage of the platform, user blogs. So some of the very early users were real geeks who had their own blogs that they built themselves, hand-coded HTML or whatever. And a lot of those blogs are still there. And of course, Twitter's relatively open actually as a platform company, and its own company blog archives are still available. Through the process of conducting these interviews and talking with people, we realized that the key features that make Twitter were actually the site of the most intense change, contestation, and reflection. It's not something we really expected, because it seems like such a nerdy and technical aspect of the history of a platform. But it turns out that these three features, the @, the hashtag, and the retweet, that are most tied up with the Twitterness of Twitter, if you like, also were subject to a lot of changes over time. And we identified some common patterns. First, users actually appropriate a feature or an idea from other platforms or other cultural contexts in order to serve a need that they see that the platform isn't currently meeting. Eventually, Twitter, the company, adopts and hardwires that feature into the platform, which make it work in some ways and not in other ways. There's always contestation among the user community or between the user community and the platform company about how these features should or shouldn't work. Things continue to evolve and iterate, and contestation continues. So there's a very, very dynamic and lively politics to such mundane things as the features of the platforms that we use every day. And we've boiled down the main areas of contestation. So all the way down at every layer of the stack, there's a struggle between the idea that Twitter is a global platform for news, for politics, for debate, for deliberative democracy on the one hand, or about interpersonal, sociable, and ephemeral uses on the other. These two things, of course, don't have to be in conflict, but discursively and technically in Twitter, they really are. And along the way is the growth, the insidious growth and embedding of a metricized media logic or social media logic, as Josie van Dijk and Thomas Pearl call it, that has kind of overdetermined the evolution of these features and their uses. I'm going to try to briefly fly through a little story of each of these three characters in Twitter's life story, and then come to a sudden stop in about 10 to 15 minutes. So let's go. So first, the @ we think about this as the modulator of Twitter's social relations, its sociability, and its anti-social challenges and toxicity as well. In fact, I think more than any other feature of the platform, the @ is what makes Twitter social media. It starts to appear early on in the life of the platform, in the very beginning, about 2006, actually as a marker of location or activity. And this is very much tied to that kind of broadcasting everyday update logic of what early Twitter was for. And this is actually borrowed from Dodgeball, location-based service. So you see here that some of the early employees saying that they're at doing errands, or the location at which you're eating your breakfast burrito. Again, no vowels, right? At a place called Herbivore, or just marking your status literally, as Jack Dorsey does, saying at work. There's a lot of contestation and debate. Everyone wants to claim that they invented the @reply. There's a lot of debate on the tech blogs about this, but it seems like this is probably the first use of the @ symbol to refer to another user. And then this is a common pattern that we see quite a lot in early Twitter. The users actually having explicit conversations about, it would be good if we could let people know that we're talking about them, so that it would be easier to find mentions and have interpersonal conversations in amidst the stream of tweets that are coming through. And this is, I love this. It's quite humorous because Neil Crosby replies archly with a demonstration of how this might work. That blue text, which is the hyperlink back to the user profile, didn't do anything at this point. So this is not exactly how the tweets would have worked. Twitter later adopts the convention, the @ convention, and hardwires it in by linking back to profile pages. Of course, at the same time, there's a lot of conversation about whether Twitter, in fact, should be for chatting and conversation, or whether it should just be for more informational purposes. So one side of this argument comes from Eric Meyer, who says the way people are using Twitter right now, it's rapidly becoming the most inefficient and unusable version of IRC, that's Internet Relay Chat, ever. Look, people, if you want to chat, then get a chat room, and I think we hear this through the next 10 years of Twitter, of people complaining that there's too much chatter, too much noise, too much pointless babble. On the other hand, often women or people who value the texture of everyday life, who value the use of social media to build friendships, we're talking about this concept of ambient intimacy, where it's actually quite nice to eavesdrop on other people's conversations, as long as it's not creepy, to know what people are having for lunch, in fact. This is a really core debate in early Twitter. Twitter tries to find its way through these different options by hardwiring in a version of the @reply that hides conversations between people that you don't follow. And then, of course, a lot of early adopters get really upset about this. Again, a pattern that we see, this kind of pattern of contestation. These days, of course, we have all kinds of different instantiations of the @ feature within the platform, including the ability to build your own thread by replying to yourself. And replying to yourself was something you could never do. But it's an indication of this shift, I think, to a media logic, a broadcast logic. This is a nice example actually of a really consciously produced thread that amplifies the experiences of undergrads during COVID. A little bit of data here. We can see, if we look at the different categories of the proportions of different categories of tweets over time. This is from an Australian collection of tweets over 10 years from the very beginning of Twitter just up to 2016. In the purple there, you can see there's that retweets are growing. The red is replies. You can see they're actually shrinking. And plain tweets are also shrinking. So in fact, Twitter is becoming less conversational and arguably less sociable. So the story of the @reply is a story of a kind of messy sociable chatter to tweet storms, because of course @replies are the way that you can engage in a mass pile-on and attack somebody or argue with somebody. So they're the center of a lot of antagonism and toxicity as well, but also threads, and that's quite a nice thing. The next to develop is the hashtag. So we think about the hashtag as the way that users tried to start organizing the conversation. As you went from maybe having 50 friends on Twitter to being encountered with just a massive stream of endless tweets. How did you organize this? How did you find conversations that you might like to be part of? I have to acknowledge here that there were lots of people who were trying to solve this problem. It just happens to be that Chris Messina archived his attempts to get hashtags to happen, and therefore he kind of owns the story. So, to history, history belongs to the people who have the best blogs in this case, I think. But it's certainly the case that that Messina was part of a conversation amongst early adopters about what kinds of protocols or markers could they use to organize tweets. But it was really interesting to me that the debate was about kind of, should we organize tweets into groups of people? So kind of like mini forums, or should we organize tweets into channels? So like streams of content on a topic. Again, this is a kind of conflict between a sort of social logic and a sort of media logic. They didn't really take off particularly well until there was a use case for them. And that use case was crisis communication, and particularly natural disasters, in this case, a wildfire or a brush fire in San Diego. Famously or infamously, it seems to be the case that Messina fronted up to the Twitter officers and tried to convince them to adopt hashtags, and they thought they were kind of stupid and dumb and ugly and unusable, which I think maybe designers still agree with. Early on, as hashtags were started to take off, particularly in tech conferences, there was the development of third-party innovations like hashtags.org, a website which actually created a directory of current hashtags which you could opt into. Of course, all of this is later folded into Twitter search, which at the time didn't exist. Twitter bought a company called Surmise, which provided a tweet search service. Hashtags have come to actually be meeting places. So this is an example that I've studied a bit, which is called AgChat Oz. There's AgChats in Canada and other countries as well, where there was a kind of a weekly meetup on Wednesday night using a particular hashtag, AgChat Oz, to discuss issues about life on the farm, rural politics, and so on. Of course, hashtags are infamously overused by social media marketing types, as this meme kind of mocks. And hashtags in combination with organization offline and media organizations have been used to convene counterpublics. So a really important one in Australia is the Indigenous X hashtag, which serves as a place to convene Indigenous publics in Australia, but it also links to this Twitter account, Indigenous X, which has rotating hosting by Indigenous cultural leaders in Australia. It also connects globally to the First Nations movements. And of course, in the US, Black Lives Matter began as a hashtag in response to the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, and then becomes an integral part of street protests and a formal organization. And likewise with Me Too, founded by Tarana, which started as a hashtag by Tarana Burke as part of her social justice work, was picked up by celebrities and has become a broader phenomenon. Hashtags have grown steadily over time, and they're still in use, but perhaps still more of a minority practice in terms of actual everyday Twitter use that we might expect. But the story of hashtags is a way to is beginning as a way to kind of organize conversations into channels, to convening ad hoc publics, to what we must have to recognize now, I think, as kind of cultural war zones. Finally, the retweet, invented by users as a way to cite the tweets of other users or to rebroadcast the tweets of other users while giving proper attribution and accuracy, but they've become something quite different. In fact, they've just become a kind of amplifier button. So early on, there were a lot of challenges about how to quote people accurately, give them credit for their words, how to acknowledge when you've edited them. So a really kind of literary practice, very, very nerdy, I have to say. So here's me in 2008 saying that I wasn't too keen on the recent and rapid growth in retweeting, and then 2 months later making a joke about retweets of retweets, and the kind of cry for attention that appealing for people to retweet your stuff seemed to encode. So very early on, kind of anticipating, I think, the drive for Twitter users to be more concerned with attention than connection, perhaps. Similarly, Nancy Bain here early on noticing that that manual retweeting practices seem to be leading to a degradation of meaning. So perhaps worries about inaccuracy, misinformation. So Twitter, of course, moves to encode the retweet formally into its platform, saying that BizStone saying here that the retweet is a great example of Twitter teaching the company what it wants to be. But of course, it encodes particular ways of doing it. Looked like this. There was a lot of controversy about the fact that when the button retweet comes in, that would put tweets by people you didn't follow into your feed for the first time. So it's actually a very tiny technical thing, but a profound shift from your Twitter stream being the tweets of people that you follow, and perhaps some conversations they were having with other people, to all of a sudden, all these news headlines, all of these celebrities, all of these people you don't follow in your feed. So completely changing the experience. And of course, all this ties on the back end to these social media logics that I was talking about. So we all have our own personal dashboards where we can check our metrics of attention and which of our tweets are more successful in getting retweeted or getting replied to. And as we can see here, like I was saying in the purple there, the retweet button has led to just, I think, a real change and distortion in the logics of Twitter, the culture of Twitter, from kind of a collegial citation practice, very nerdy, probably not appropriate for a mass user base, then conversion to a metric by hardwiring it into the platform, and now a compulsive amplification button. So I haven't done this with all of the features because of time, but in the book we kind of track through these processes, the appropriation, incorporation, contestation, and iteration of each feature. And of course, most recently in the lead up to the election, but which of course is a particular presidential election in one country, Twitter's trying to fix this problem of compulsive amplification, particularly of misinformation, and forcing you to, or nudging you to read an article before retweeting it, and also nudging you to add a comment to a tweet. So winding back to the manual retweet process almost. This is not popular with everyone because it comes into conflict with other users of Twitter, such as creative people's uses of tweets to broadcast or share their creative work. And a quote retweet of somebody's brilliant joke maybe isn't so appropriate.
Jean.
Yes, I'm on my last slide.
Please.
I'm on my last slide.
Okay.
So in summary, we see Twitter's life story as is common with many social media platforms, as from something that really didn't know what it was, but that various user communities and cultures made into something that served their needs. But of course, these needs are competing. To a certain phase of business maturity as the venture capital runs out, where the business seeks to grow, and therefore they seek to formalize features, to acquire companies that were formerly providing third-party services, to smooth out and make consistent the user experience. At the same time, the advertising industry is the main source of potential revenue. And so gradually, all of these processes of platform redesign lead the platform further and further along the path to a media industry model. So the retweet button is really built on a kind of copyright, respecting copyright logic, which is something from the media industry. It's not a social media logic at all. And gradually, this proliferation of third-party innovations and user innovations is brought under control into a more mature business environment, which also restricts the platform possibilities. But at the same time, the cultures of use of every platform, including Twitter, remain incredibly diverse. There are publics and counter-publics with their own creative energies and their own idea about what platforms should be for, including as platforms for civic engagement. And so contestation continues and the story is not over. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean Burgess. It's been very stimulating to think about Twitter as a lot of cultures. So I was thinking about a question that I wanted to ask you further. Now I invite Lance Bennett, Professor Lance Bennett, to present his reflections and provocations.
Thank you, and thanks, Jean, for going just the right length of time so I could deal with all the technical problems, which I hope don't come back to us. But so let's see if we can start. Hello, everyone, wherever you may be in the world. It's good to be here. I wish I could see you. And sorry that I'm not in my normal location for broadcasting. So I need to try and get this up and running. But maybe I should start it at the beginning rather than the end. So how is that? Can you see it?
Still not.
Still not. What do you recommend I do?
On the cell, you click on share screen.
Yeah, I do.
And then it opens another small window where you can choose. Oh, now I see it. Now I can add the stream.
You see the show? If I run it, will it work?
It is working. We can see the.
You can see the slides, but can you see me anymore?
Yes, we can see you still. We see
Okay,
you on the.
Okay, this is strange. I can only see the slides, so I'm sorry for that. But so what I want to talk about today is a little bit different than Jean's talk. I'm really looking at the crisis of liberal democracy around the world. You know it very well in Brazil. We know it all too well in the U.S. Australia is having a touch of the problem, as are many countries in Europe and other places in the world. But what I want to do is a little bit different, is looking at both the role of the left and the right in this crisis of democracy. The right is more determined to kind of end liberal democracy as we once knew it. But both the left and the right, interestingly enough, have encountered problems and have raised criticisms of many liberal democracies as a result of several factors. One is the hollowing or the weakening of center-left and center-right parties due to global economic pressures, political corruption, and business power. which results in a real electoral representation gap. The rich get way better representation than do lower income groups in many societies. This varies, of course, from country to country. But there is a growing popular belief that I've tracked through many, mainly European and North American democracies, and it occurs on both the left and on the right, that traditional center-left, center, and center-right parties do not represent us. And this was presaged many years ago in Colin Crouch's lovely book, Post-Democracy. So what that means is that almost everywhere in the democracies today, you get double austerity, both from government in terms of cuts in programs and reduced public services. We are paying much money for public education in the US today. And in the private sector through stagnant wages, the lack of growth in wages over the last 30 years and rising levels of unemployment among young people. There's also growing inequality. It's becoming a society of haves and have-nots in many countries. And this, of course, affects politics and representation as well. And as a result of that, there has been an anti-globalization reaction on both the left and the right at global economic regimes and the cosmopolitan elites who run them. This began on the left in the 90s and has now become a main topic on the right today. But it's interesting that there are very different political and communication responses on the left and the right. Many citizens on the left, and we have data for Europe on this, it's in a paper in Information, Communication, and Society called The Democratic Interface. You can see some of the data there. But many on the left have disconnected from parties and elections because they don't believe that they can get representation from their traditional center-left or even green parties in some cases. And the focus has been turned to democracy at the local level and many varieties of identity politics. And even when left parties try to build online platforms, the participation rates are very low, as Pablo Gerbaudo showed in his recent book. In Spain, only 4% of the possible members of Podemos have participated on average in online initiatives. So there's been a disconnection from national political party and election level politics on the left. Meanwhile, the right has promoted national identity movements through a mix of media strategies and pretty traditional party organizations, using social media networks and propaganda to mobilize supporters, and then using traditional party organization and elections to gain power. So let's look at these two versions of sort of late modern, postmodern democracy, starting with the right. What we find is that radical movements and parties are really attacking the moral and institutional foundations of liberal democracy. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. Using a combination of social media mobilization platforms, Twitter has become a very popular one, as Jane just discussed, but many and more new ones all the time, as very right-wing movements are being driven from some platforms to others, and combined with traditional party and campaign organizations. And what's the goal? I can just run down the list in the US, but I think you could come up with similar looking lists in many other countries for the radical right. There are attacks on racial minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities. Attacks on political opponents are increasing. Lock them up is a chant at Trump rallies in the US. And censoring and intimidating the press, undermining courts and the rule of law, disrupting civil society organizations. I know in Brazil that a lot of environmental organizations have been under fire and in trouble over activism on the Amazon and other areas of environmental concern. There is a lean toward authoritarian leadership, Donald Trump and many others. We could talk about Orban in Hungary, or the Polish regime, or what's happened to Turkey, which is no longer a credible democracy in many ways. And then weakening of international agreements such as the Paris Climate Accords. And there was a kidnapping plot against the governor of Michigan after Trump had tweeted and told his rallies to liberate Michigan. Suddenly, armed right-wingers began to plan to kidnap the governor of the state. These parties are leaning toward Russia as a model of illiberal democracy. This is an interesting photo that I think captures an era. This is the Austrian foreign minister who got married, invited Putin, and gave the bridal dance to Mr. Putin. That party has been ousted from government in a scandal, but they were leaning in the direction of Russia at the time this wedding occurred. And one of the things that I think is important to think about is that these movements and parties on the right have weaponized information by spreading alternative facts, conspiracies, attacks on opponents through all variety of media, from political websites, social media such as Twitter, bots, trolls, fake news, and hacking. The result is that there have been attacks on the press, attacks on science, climate science in particular, but also medical science involving the COVID epidemic, as we know, in both Brazil and in the US, where it seems that the two leaders are really playing from the same kind of script. And there's also intensive communication focused on national identity. In many cases, that basically means ethnic and light-skinned national identity formations. So how does this stuff spread? Well, here's a picture of a famous scandal in the US that started in the 2016 election of Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party, yes, running a diabolical child sex trafficking ring from the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. Turns out that this came out of nowhere, quite the edges of the wild internet fringe, but it made it quickly through Twitter and through a few platforms that are very right-wing propaganda platforms into a large and very active sharing network, retweeting network, and linking network. As a result of two threats faced by Donald Trump right before the election in 2016. One is that the Russians seem to be helping him because they hacked the Democratic Party email from which this crazy story came. But also there was a recording released where Trump was talking about sexually assaulting women and getting away with it. These two things didn't look so good for Trump. Suddenly this story became huge, claiming that it wasn't the Democratic Party at all. It wasn't the Russians. It was actually the Democratic Party that had been hacked by its own angry workers. And this became a big story that spilled into the mainstream news through YouTube, Reddit, and finally made its way into the New York Times. And today, I mean, you can think of that as a crazy story that nobody believed, but today that has become part of the global Q conspiracy story of global elites who are ruining the world and also running child sex trafficking rings. So there's more to these communication practices than just spreading disinformation, confusion, and disruption, although they certainly are doing those things. But right-wing media networks also act as, media networks like these, where you get very dense interconnections and coordinated activities, that these networks are beginning to serve as organizations to respond to political threats like that crazy Pizzagate, and now the QAnon story has it, to coordinate connective actions, to link networks, to frame their activities, and to direct attention and action, and to allocate resources from raising money online to delivering timely information and telling people where to go and what to do. So we see the coordination of right-wing networks. We see the European right-wing networks being quite well organized and coordinated with annual conferences. And this was 2016, which they endorsed Brexit. And Brexit, of course, happened. This is the US and Making America Great Again, which is really a conversation about who are the real citizens, who are the people, which echoes the 1920s and 30s in Germany, where the question was, wer ist das Volk? Who are the people? And now there are claims on both sides, left and right, to we are the real people. And that, of course, is not going to end well for democracy and common reality. So we see Brazil and Trump being in this right-wing network. And this is a interesting photo of Trump getting that famous soccer jersey. I'm sure he doesn't quite know what that is, but that isn't the point. So let's turn quickly to the democracy challenge on the left. The focus I'd like to give, there's a lot I could say about this, but time is short. So we could focus mainly today on the political fragmentation of the left. The left is not organized. It doesn't have an ideological center anymore. And there have been efforts to develop communication technologies, but most of those technologies have actually reinforced the fragmentation rather than solve that problem. So there are diverse issue agendas on the left, which really dating back to the 90s and the protests against globalization have favored a kind of a new political culture or a reinvention of an old political culture of direct deliberative democracy. Face-to-face democracy, and the celebration of diversity rather than the attempt to produce a kind of a coherent political program. So we have a lot of technology development involving deliberation platforms, decision-making platforms, party agenda-setting platforms, but there's been very little that has resulted in the way of stable networks or successful party organization. Even Podemos and Syriza, they're two of the kind of more modern day leftist parties that have done well, have abandoned the technology and the sort of distributed model of the party for a more conventional, traditional model. And what you get on the left instead is really impressive. I mean, really quite impressive, very large scale, but very short term uses of commercial social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and on and on and on and on, to organize mass protests. We've seen this beginning with the MA15 in Spain, the Occupy Wall Street, the revolutions in the Middle East, Me Too and Black Lives Matter in more recent times. What these mobilizations using technology have achieved is quite impressive in terms of kind of organizational outcomes. This is a map that we drew of Occupy Wall Street. It's based on a sample of millions and millions of tweets that we had, random sample. But its goal is to look at what accounts are distributing what kinds of resources and what kinds of resources are being shared in the crowd. And so what we discovered is that there are many different kinds of resources that if you add them up, begin to look like what an organization would be doing if it were a more formal organization. But it doesn't last. So in order to make these things last, there have been many attempts to build what you might call connective parties or net parties or networked parties or platform parties. There have been various names for these things. I'm going to call them connective parties for reasons you might guess. First of all, citizens need networks to deliberate and share positions, so that has to be a technology requirement. And central party actors need to be responsive and engage with and actually change in response to the positions from the periphery, from the party members. And the center and the periphery need to become engaged in co-producing party agendas, candidate selection, and engagement in elections. So we've got some examples. The Pirates didn't end well, didn't work well. Podemos started out as more of a connective party that ended in a very conventional party and stopped growing as a result of that. Barcelona in Comú is being promoted by a number of colleagues of mine in Barcelona as the model for democracy, and yet it barely works in Barcelona. So what about the national level democracy? That is kind of fallen out of the equation. The Danish Alternative, similarly, very small party that's not growing. So quickly, let me run through the case of what happened to Podemos in Spain. you see all of these local circles of direct democracy were left after the MF15 Indignados uprisings in 2011. And those circles were kind of reconnected around a model of a general council that would interact with them and create a unified party position on a number of things. Turns out that didn't work well. It was complicated. It was hard for the party to understand what all these different local communities were telling them, because it was quite diverse. So as a result, Pablo Iglesias, there was a blow up in the party. Pablo Iglesias took sort of central command, united with the old leftist kind of communist, what is now the former Communist Party, and became a traditional candidate, going on TV, giving interviews. And the result of that in the intervening years is that if you look, this is the Conservative Party vote from 2015 to 2016. This party was suffering scandal that eventually brought it down. But as you can see, the Conservatives increased. And after the merger with the Unidos Party, Podemos Unidos dropped 1 million votes in one election, in 1 year. So let's look at Barcelona and Comú, which is governing as a minority coalition, very interesting but not very stable one. It developed all kinds of digital tools, online forums for agenda setting and linking to neighborhoods and commissions and coordinating councils, offline and online deliberation using a platform that's been called Democracy Operating System. I would commend you to look at the work of colleagues in Barcelona. Maria Haber, Ismael Peña Lopez, Burgess, Santa Marina have been doing wonderful work on this stuff. And here's a little picture of what we mean by parties that don't adopt a conventional organization. These are all the parties that were involved in the 2015 Barcelona City Council election, and this is Barcelona and Comú. These are the other parties. As you can see, the retweet networks for all the other parties are retweets around the party leadership and candidates' tweets, except for Barcelona and Comú. Here's the party, and here are the movement organizations and the numerous movement organizations that are conducting basically their own election campaigns in a coalition that is not working well in terms of connective platform party organization. So I'm going to end with some questions about connective democratic organization. On the left, how can technology-mediated participation be coordinated? I think there are serious problems despite the goals and the desires of lots of people on the left. And can it scale? Can it go even beyond Barcelona in the Spanish context, or beyond some cities in other contexts? And can it achieve some kind of large-scale organization? And how can leadership share power and decision-making with followers? That's an age-old question about parties, but it has not been answered by technology. And how can tech developers design more effective participatory and deliberative platforms, especially when many of the core activists really don't trust online deliberation, but value face-to-face democracy? I'll close on a story that during the Occupy protests in the US, I was involved in a project for civic technology development. And so we made contact with a number of Occupy tech developers, and we developed a platform so that when the physical occupations disappeared, as they did, the police removed them, winter set in, it was very hard to camp out in the freezing rain and cold. But many of the last of the Occupy protesters resisted adopting a platform because it didn't meet their standards for democracy. So after this assault from the right and the kind of drift away from national politics on the left, we end up with what might be called a democratic disconnect, in which citizens in the US and in Europe, and I don't know about Brazil and other democracies, but have really decided that democracy is not so essential for them. These are birth cohorts in Europe and the US from the 1930s, where in Europe, these people grew up under fascism. But by the 1950s, when democracies were implemented, developed fairly strong commitments to democracy being important. And as you can see today, that is not the case among those born after the 1980s, and even less so in the US. And in similar polls, the question, having a democratic political system is a bad or very bad way to run this country, that figure in 2011 was up to 25%, and I'm guessing it would be more than that, probably 30 or more % in the US today among young citizens. And similarly in Europe, although the figures are not as high. So what can academics, journalists, and citizens do? Well, I think we can all contextualize our communication analysis within larger questions of the institutions and the cultural aspects of politics and democracy. We can understand which communication logics and what technologies are operating in different political groups from the left to the right. And I hope we can develop as a field, as an interesting interdisciplinary field, new normative perspectives on institutions, communication, and democracy. And with that, I will say thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you both. And now we are going to listen to the questions of the public. But first of all, I had made a question, and now after your presentations, some of my inquietations have been answered, but I would do it anyway. So we used to be talking about democratic process of participation, right? How can we think of recent demonstrations that push for revoking social rights that seem to be more strong than protests for more social rights? When they are undemocratic, how can we think about political participation in democracy? I ask that because we have had here in Brazil, I quote, protest in favor of, in reaction to the protest against, for example, Bolsonaro's policies, if we can call them policies, like budget cuts and social policies. They use hate speech to support their calls for a dictatorship. And in a work paper presented here yesterday, they say in the digital media they were sealed with Bolsonaro. Okay, in this context, I formulate these questions. I'm thinking of 2 points. Bennett, when you have been talking in some articles about this disconnection you were talking about, of publics from institutions of press and politics in disrupted public spheres, how can we think about the construction of a way to participate in an effective way? You start talking about it at the end of your presentation. And Professor Burgess, I was thinking about this, the role of hashtags in social protesting. You both mentioned Black Lives Matter, Me Too. I like to remember my favorite. It was a Yes or Woman. And the concern on how these hashtags can reach a trending topic and how the activists are satisfied with that. So, and then I am not, they don't extrapolate this action in social media. They are satisfied with that. So what Jean Burgess said about compulsive amplification, is it relation with, is that any relation with that, with this desire of to be in trending topics?
Who should respond first? You want me to start?
Sure.
Although I tried to fit too much into a short talk, the point I was making about hashtag publics is that I'm aware of the critique of so-called slacktivism, where people just compulsively retweet hashtags and they think their job is done. I'm suspicious of that argument. I think it's always been the case that there's a core of people who are really involved and engaged in attempting to affect transformations in any activist space. And there are others who amplify that message via the media. But the point I was trying to make, particularly about Black Lives Matter, as I think is well known now, is this the flow of activity and action across the social media space and the street. Although I don't want to valorize or overemphasize the importance of street protest, because that's a highly gendered way to think about political action as well, that you have to put your body on the line and subject it to state violence in order to be truly active. But in that case, a hashtag helps to mobilize an already existing public and community of Black Twitter, and to connect activities on the street and formal organizational practices. So I think we have to understand such acute events that mobilize hashtags as hybrid media events that happen across media spaces and across offline spaces. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I completely agree that we should not dismiss most of these as slacktivism events. I mean, in fact, the protests in the US today, in very difficult conditions with the pandemic raging in this country, as I know it is in Brazil as well, is largely due to hashtag activism, and would not be as effective if, and it's multiple layers of media. So it's not just Twitter, it's all kinds of media that are providing, as I pointed out earlier in that one Twitter network retweet slide about Occupy Wall Street, they're providing an organizational infrastructure which unfortunately is very thin, but it works. It gets people into the streets, it shares ideas about how to protest, and it constantly updates framing of the protest. So you can see the protest frames change over time, really through social network communication. But my problem with all of the hashtag identity politics groups going on out there is not with their issues, which are certainly valid issues, most of them, but it's with the fact that they have disconnected from the rightward authoritarian drift of the entire political system in which they are protesting. And if they don't somehow figure out how to stop that, their protests will A, do no good, and B, well land them in jail. Because I mean, the next step toward the authoritarian outcome is to put dissidents in jail. I mean, we see that in democracies that have moved farther along that path. And we are looking at it in the US today. When Trump encourages his followers and tweets, and those tweets are retweeted to lock her up, lock him up, lock them up, those are not idle threats. Because the next step down the road is to do it.
Yep.
So that's my concern about hashtag activism. We need to deal with institutional reforms, which very few groups on the left are really engaging with.
And that leads us to a concern of how we consider public. So in this time where we are having this individualization orientation in social media, right? Okay, João, we can have some questions because I don't have access to the chat. To Jean, thank you very much for your enlightening presentation. Vitor Chagas, our colleague. I really like the idea of a biography of the platforms. which somewhat resembles the social life of things by Arjun Appadurai. I think my question, is about the agency of these platforms in the political process. Each of these adaptations has not only social impacts, but clear political impacts. You can go.
Jean?
Yep. I'm just reading the last one, the third one there.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Quickly became a repertoire of digital activism. I would like you to comment further on each of these adaptations with regard to their political effects.
I guess, well, we've just rehearsed the hashtag question again, which I suppose is central to this. And I suppose my point is that subtle changes that are embedded platform-wide to the way each of these technical features works does shape what counts as politics, what's perceived as politics, and how politics can be enacted on the platform in subtle ways. And the red thread through all of that is the metricization and datification. So by embedding these features, you also make them measurable, datifiable, and therefore you shape practices and behavior towards the seeking of attention and the garnering of those metrics, right? So while hashtags originally often could simply be used to literally convene an ephemeral issue-based public on a conversation, they then do become part of trending topics, and so then they attract all kinds of malign actors who are simply trying to either disrupt that conversation, destroy the conversation, or just use it to get attention for their own purposes. So it's more about, I wouldn't deny that they all played a role in the ability to organize politically, to enact politics, to debate or argue about politics, but they also have a politics in themselves as technical objects. Without giving the whole presentation again, I should stop talking.
I think that's a great response. I would only add that unlike formal political organizations of the old style social movement sort, it is increasingly possible to hijack hashtag movements, and that's been done in many cases. It's being done all the time in Russia, where you don't know who's talking or what they're talking about a lot of the time, and so you flood the entire network with chaos. It's been done in a more strategic way. For example, when the Me Too movement went to Germany, where of course there were people who wanted to join it there too, the right-wing Alternative for Deutschland and the identitarian movement in Germany hijacked that Twitter hashtag and began to talk about traditional women's roles, family roles, patriarchy, and offer alternative ways of thinking about women and their relations in society. So it became, I mean, it would have been nice, I guess, if it had been a kind of a debate or a discussion, but it was more of a hijacking of that movement.
There you go. Great example.
Okay, we have another question. Nadine Almer, who is our guest from tomorrow. Thank you for your question. Questions to Lance. You mentioned that activist leaders don't agree to online platforms as these don't meet their standards for democracy. What are some of these standards?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we learned...
And it goes on. There seems to be a binary between publics on the left and the right in your analysis. The left is essential in making claims on democracy, and the right as amplifiers of weaponized information.
Yeah, that of course is way too simple, but in 25 minutes, if I'm covering the world of advanced democracies, I had to commit the sin of oversimplification. So I can clarify a couple of those things, though, by saying that in our studies of Europe, we took the OECD democracies and then we finally, because the Eurobarometer provides better data for just the EU members, we finally narrowed it down to the 27 EU states. And what we did is we actually took the radical left and the radical right. So it's just the parties to the right of the Christian Democrats and the liberals, and the parties to the left of the Social Democrats, Labor, and Greens. And so what you end up with is actually very similar groups that vary in size depending on what country you're talking about, but they actually are quite remarkably balanced in almost all of those countries, but they have completely different values, completely different reactions to the political problems in their countries, and they're kind of similar, and so there is some serious similarity. When you ask about what are the qualifications for kind of the new left democracy, it involves deliberative, direct, participatory democracy, and you can unpack those terms. We know what deliberation means, but somehow online deliberation doesn't seem to be as genuine, as authentic as face-to-face deliberation, which if you see how complicated that becomes in even a smallish setting like Barcelona, it's a very exhausting process, and it may end up not being all that democratic in the end. Interviews we did with Occupy core leadership and sort of more peripheral participants suggested that the direct, deliberative, participatory requirements for getting your voice heard and for shaping the agenda were just exhausting for too many people. And so in the end, it became to the peripheral members a non-democratic experience. And that was sort of the goal for platform democracy, was to broaden the representative nature of deliberation, but people don't use it. So I can't tell you all the reasons why people don't use it. I can tell you a few. One is that they don't believe that the party leaders are actually being responsive, and in most cases they're not. So that's a genuine concern. And on the party leadership side, it's very hard to distill and process all of the inputs. I mean, that was the end of the Pirate Party when they invited everybody to participate, and many people did, and it was very unclear what to do next.
Next question, please. I heard there are a lot of questions here today. Marco Konopaki. Professor Jean, good to listen to you again. I understand the multi-determinacy of your model of analysis. Nonetheless, do you think it is possible to weight the user agency determining further developments? I am asking regarding datafication and the power that platforms have on users' behavior shaping. Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your new book.
Thank you, Marco. Good to see your face on the comment. I think you're asking a question about the contingency or the constraints on user agency given the algorithmic turn that platforms have taken and so on. And I would just resist the word behavior in general on principle. That's just a disciplinary thing of mine. But it's certainly the case that the algorithmic curation of the Twitter feed in terms of what we see, I think trending topics are generally ignored by users in my understanding these days, but certainly the platform has redesigned the way that content is presented to us such that it takes a lot of manual workarounds on the back end to try to, for example, see a reverse chronological stream of tweets from people that you follow. And that, again, is to do with the pushing of content that will lead to advertising revenue. Twitter is also trying to nudge us away from having arguments and and conversations, making it so much longer story, but a lot of changes that are recently being made to nudge behavior towards so-called healthy conversation have been done to try to undo things the platform did to try to promote attentional logics in the first place. So if more care had been taken and more and they had listened better to diverse users who are more concerned with conviviality and sociability and less with attention in the first place, we wouldn't have this problem. But yes, I think there are, of course, we're trying to exert agency under conditions not of our making all the time. And I think that is becoming more constrained than it was at the beginning of the platform when it didn't know what it was and it was relatively open technically.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, I think. Gabriele Medrado, thank you for your question. Professor Bennett, what do you consider as the major problems in the development of participation and deliberation platforms? Thank you all for this great presentation.
To put it simply, the major problem is the users. They don't use them, and there isn't a good mechanism for authenticating, for determining in transparent ways what the sometimes thousands of inputs back in the early days of Podemos, when the circles were active, there were millions of participants. And it's very hard to distill that in a coherent way that's also transparent at the same time, whether it's through AI or through direct moderation. People don't trust what happened to their inputs and why their inputs don't look like the outputs coming from the leadership. And the leadership, I must say, I think Podemos is an unusual case in Spain because Pablo Iglesias is basically a Marxist who didn't necessarily believe in this direct, deliberative, democratic experience. I mean, it's ideologically unfamiliar if you're an ideologue. And so that was a complicating factor, but he couldn't run an election campaign with the level of chaos that was being generated by their online organizations. So he simply refashioned the party into a traditional political party. And it turns out that he lost about 1 million votes, most of whom were old MA15 protesters from the distributed networks on the periphery of that party. So that was a pretty significant loss. It's hard to lose 1 million votes when you actually merge with 2 parties, but they did. So I think that there, and you can look at the 5-star experience in Italy and come up with a very different set of issues and problems. So wherever you go, you sort of see interactions between local cultures and political agendas and the technology and the political system in which all of this is operating. And those interactions are very challenging for designing platform parties that work the way traditional ones did on the election side.
Unfortunately, we are reaching our time in this meeting. So there's a lot of things that I would like to hear from you. Since the social media cultures that Burgess explore, since that so important concept of connective action and collective action from Lance Bennett, but we have to finish. And then I'd like to thank you very much, very, very, very much for this time with us at the National Institute of Science and Technology and Digital Democracy. And have a good night. And we hope to see you again soon.
And I hope
Thank you
in person someday. Thanks for everything.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.